The studio had been open for 10 years, which meant the champagne was expensive and the speeches ran long. My daughter had rented out the entire ground floor of a converted textile mill in Portland. Exposed brick Edison bulbs, the kind of space that photographs beautifully and costs more than it should. I'd driven up from Ashland that morning, 4 hours and 40 minutes, which I know because I timed it, the way I've timed every trip I've made to see her in the last decade. I hadn't been invited, but I hadn't been told not to come either. With my daughter, that had always been its own kind of invitation. The guests were mostly younger, her colleagues, a few clients, some people I recognized from the early days when she'd first started sketching the logo on the back of a takeout bag at my kitchen table. The place smelled like cedar and new paint. There were framed prints along the exposed brick wall, her best work over the years. I stopped in front of one near the entrance, a commercial interior she'd designed for a hotel lobby in Bend, all clean lines and warm light. I remembered sitting beside her at that drafting table for 3 weekends straight while she worked through the proportions. I remembered ordering Chinese food at 11 at night and spreading the containers across the floor because there was no surface left. My name wasn't on any of the plaques. That wasn't why I came. I wasn't looking for credit. I came because 10 years is a long time and she was my daughter, and I still believed, even then, that showing up mattered. She found me near the appetizer table around 7. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of dry sage, and her hair was pinned up in a way that made her look effortlessly composed. She always did. Even as a teenager, she had that quality, the ability to look like she'd never struggled for anything. "You're here," she said, and smiled with her mouth. "I drove up this morning," I said. "I brought those crackers you like, the ones from the deli on Oak Street. They're on the table in the back." She didn't respond to that. Someone across the room caught her eye and she lifted a hand and excused herself, and I stood there with my glass of champagne and watched her move through her own party like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Which she was. I just hadn't expected to feel so much like a piece of furniture. The speech came at 8:30. She stood a small riser near the windows, and the room quieted around her the way rooms always did when she spoke. She had her father's voice, low and measured, the kind that made people lean in. She thanked her business partner. She thanked 3 clients by name. She thanked her husband, who stood near the wall with a beer, and smiled when she said it. She thanked a woman named Cressida, who had apparently mentored her early in her career, someone I'd never heard of, and she described her as the person who showed her what it meant to build something from nothing. There was applause. I applauded too. She didn't mention me. I told myself it was an oversight. I held the champagne flute very carefully and told myself she was nervous and that there's only so much you can fit into a speech and that I was being sensitive, which was something she had said to me before. "You're too sensitive, Mom. Not everything is about you." After the applause settled, I went to find the restroom. I passed through a short hallway that opened into a small kitchen they used for catering. My son-in-law was in there, refilling a tray of glasses. He didn't hear me come in. My daughter was behind him, checking her phone. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway. Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt exactly, more like mild inconvenience. "You doing okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "It's a beautiful event." She set her phone down. She glanced at my son-in-law and then back at me, and her voice dropped just slightly, the way it did when she was about to say something she'd already decided. "Mom, I've been meaning to say something, and I think tonight is as good a time as any." She paused. "When you show up to things like this, it makes it harder for people to take me seriously. It makes it look like I still need you here, like I can't handle things on my own." I didn't say anything. The refrigerator hummed behind her. "I've worked really hard to build something that's mine," she continued, "and I need people in this industry to see it that way, as mine." She said the last word like she was underlining it. "I love you, I do, but I think we'd both be better off with a little more distance." My son-in-law had stopped pretending to arrange the glasses. He was staring at the tray. I looked at my daughter for a moment. She looked back, steady and certain, the way she always was when she'd made up her mind about something. "Okay," I said. I set my champagne glass down on the counter beside me very gently so it didn't make a sound. I smoothed the front of my cardigan, and then I said, "Congratulations on 10 years." And I meant it, even then. And I turned and walked back through the hallway and got my coat from the rack near the entrance and left, without saying goodbye to anyone. The drive back to Ashland was dark and very quiet. I didn't listen to the radio. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the highway unroll ahead of me and didn't cry until I was past Eugene, and even then it was just my eyes, not the rest of me. My house was cold when I got home. I'd turned the heat down before I left, the way my late husband always insisted. No sense heating an empty house, Lena. I could still hear him say it. Holt had been practical about everything except the things that mattered, and those he was as sentimental as anyone I'd ever known. I turned the heat up, put the kettle on, and went into the study. There was a flat wooden box on the second shelf of the bookcase, behind a row of architecture volumes. Holt had built it himself, years ago. A simple thing. Pine and brass hinges, about the size of a shoebox. We called it the ledger box, though what was inside wasn't exactly a ledger, it was more like a record. A private one. I'd started keeping it the year my daughter graduated from RISD when she called and said she had an opportunity. A small design firm in Portland was interested in her work, but they couldn't offer her a salary yet, just a contract, and she'd need to cover her own overhead for the first 6 months. Could I help? I could. I always could. The box held copies of everything: bank transfers, loan documents, a signed promissory note from 2017 that my daughter had agreed to and then stopped referencing as if it had never existed. Receipts for equipment I'd bought. A wide-format printer, 2 monitor setups, a drafting table that had once been mine and that I'd paid to have shipped across the state. A letter I'd written to the Oregon Design Foundation on her behalf in 2019, advocating for her inclusion in their Emerging Professionals Grant program. She'd gotten the grant, $12,000. I also held the guarantee. That was the piece she'd never fully understood, or perhaps had chosen not to think about. When she signed the original lease on the studio space in 2014, her credit history wasn't enough to satisfy the landlord. I'd signed as guarantor. My name, my credit, my liability if anything went wrong. We never talked about it explicitly after that day. She signed the lease. I signed the guarantee. We had lunch, and she said she'd pay me back everything someday, and I said there was no rush, and then we didn't talk about it again for 9 years. I sat at the kitchen table with the box open in front of me and went through every page. The kettle started to whistle. I got up, poured the water, came back. The stack of transfers and receipts filled most of the table. 22 separate financial events, totaling more than I will say here, because saying the number out loud has never made me feel anything but tired. Not one had been repaid. I wasn't angry, sitting there. That's the part that's hard to explain. I'd expected to be angry and I wasn't. I felt something more like clarity, like when you've been staring at a difficult drawing for a long time and you finally understand where the proportions are wrong. I closed the box, washed my cup, and went to bed. In the morning, I called my attorney. His office was downtown, 3rd floor of a building that had been a savings and loan in another life. He was a patient man, not given to dramatic statements, which was why I'd worked with him for 20 years. I spread the documents on his desk, and he reviewed them without comment, reading each page slowly the way he always did. "The guarantor position," he said finally, "is still active. You were never released from it." "I know. You could request release now, or," he looked at me over his reading glasses, "you could contact the landlord directly to discuss the terms." "I'd like to explore the second option," I said, quietly. He nodded. He didn't ask why. That was another thing I appreciated about him. From there, I drove to my credit union. I had 2 accounts that my daughter had access to. One I'd set up years ago for household emergencies, which she'd long since repurposed for things I would not call emergencies. A catering bill for a client event, a rebooking fee for a vacation she'd missed, new tires for a car that had been perfectly good before she decided it wasn't. The other account was linked to a business credit card in her name that I'd been paying the balance on quarterly since 2020. I sat across from a young woman at the branch and spoke quietly and clearly. I wanted both accounts restructured. The card would be deactivated at the end of the business day. The shared account would be closed. She asked if everything was all right. I told her it was, and thanked her, and meant it. The grant nomination took the most thought. The Oregon Design Foundation had opened applications for their annual Distinguished Studio Award the previous month. I'd submitted a nomination packet for my daughter's studio in the first week, compiled her project portfolio, written a 2-page letter of support, gathered 3 letters from clients I'd personally contacted on her behalf. She didn't know I'd done it. I'd planned to tell her at the party. I called the foundation's office that afternoon and asked to speak with the nominations coordinator. I explained that I needed to withdraw a recently submitted nomination. She pulled up the record. She said the packet was strong and asked if I was certain. I told her I was, thanked her, and ended the call. Then I sent a text to my daughter. It was short. I'd written it twice before I sent it. "You were right. I'll give you the distance you asked for. I won't be in touch." She didn't respond for 6 hours, and when she did, it was a single line. "Okay, Mom, I think that's probably for the best." I read it, set the phone down, and started packing. I hadn't planned to move, but I'd been thinking about it for longer than I'd admitted to myself. And the week after the party, the thinking became deciding. I had a friend from my working years who had retired to a small town on the southern Oregon coast. One of those places people end up when they stop needing to be where the work is. She'd mentioned more than once that a cottage 2 doors down from her had been sitting empty. I called her on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had the address. By the following Monday, I had the keys. I took what I needed: my drafting tools, a box of books, Holt's old wool blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar, a photograph of us on the coast from the year before he got sick, when we'd rented a canoe and capsized it in about 4 feet of water and laughed until we couldn't breathe. I left the furniture. I left the dishes. I left the paintings on the walls. I left one envelope on the kitchen table, unsealed. Inside was a single handwritten line. Not an explanation, just a date, the date I'd signed the studio guarantee, and the clause number from the original lease agreement. Nothing else. I locked the front door and slid my key under the mat and drove south. My daughter's business credit card was declined at a paper supplier in Portland on a Tuesday afternoon. This I learned indirectly, through a mutual acquaintance who'd been there when it happened. She'd stood at the register and tapped the card twice, and then held her phone up and tried the app, and finally told the supplier there must be an error, and that she'd sort it out and come back. She did not come back that day. That evening, my son-in-law looked at their household accounts. The credit line they'd relied on, the one I'd been quietly maintaining, showed a 0 balance and a deactivated status. He called the credit union. They confirmed the account had been closed by the primary account holder. He tried calling me. I had a new number by then. The landlord situation developed more slowly, the way structural problems always do. My attorney had contacted the property management company to discuss formally releasing me from the guarantee. That conversation had required documentation. That documentation had surfaced questions about the original lease terms and a subletting arrangement my daughter had entered into in 2021 without notifying the landlord. Something I hadn't known about, but which was now, inconveniently, part of the record. The property management company sent a letter to the studio. My son-in-law called me again from the old number. It rang and rang. The foundation announced their Distinguished Studio Award shortlist on a Wednesday. My daughter's name wasn't on it. I know she'd been expecting it. She'd mentioned to at least one client that she anticipated the recognition this year. The shortlist had 6 names. Hers wasn't among them. She called the foundation to ask about her submission and was told it had been withdrawn by the nominating party. I imagine that was the moment she understood. She drove to my house in Ashland on a Saturday morning, according to my neighbor 2 doors down, a woman I'd lent a pie dish to back in March and never thought to ask for its return. She emailed me a few days later, confused and a little worried, asking if everything was all right. She said, "A woman had knocked on my door for several minutes, then walked around to look in the side window, then sat on the front step for a while. She'd finally gotten up and gone to the mailbox, empty, and then sat in her car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before driving away. She said the woman looked tired. I wrote back to my neighbor and thanked her for the update. I told her everything was fine and that she could keep the pie dish. The cottage faced west, which meant in the evenings the light came in at an angle that turned everything gold. There was a small table by the window where I'd set up a portable drafting surface, not for professional work, just for the habit of it. Drawing kept my hands busy. Holt had always said I thought better with a pencil than with words, and he wasn't wrong. I'd been there 3 weeks when I opened the flat box again. I spread the records out on the table beside a fresh cup of coffee and looked at them with different eyes. Not as evidence of what had been taken, as a record of choices I had made. I'd said yes 22 times. Nobody had forced me. Nobody had threatened me. I had given because I wanted to give, and somewhere in the middle of all that giving, I had stopped being a mother and become a resource. And the difference I understood now was that a resource doesn't get to have feelings about being used. Kindness that asks for nothing in return is not a virtue if it teaches people that you have no value. I thought about that for a long time. Then I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started writing a letter to the Holt-Wexler Memorial Fund. I'd filed the paperwork for it 3 days after arriving at the cottage, a small charitable fund in my late husband's name, designated for students pursuing graduate study in interior architecture and spatial design. The initial endowment was modest, enough for 1 scholarship per year, renewable. The fund had one requirement beyond academic merit. Applicants had to submit an essay about a mentor who had shaped their work, someone who'd given their time and knowledge without expecting recognition. Holt would have been embarrassed by it. He would have said it was excessive. Then he would have quietly framed the paperwork and put it somewhere I'd find it. I sealed the letter and walked it to the small post office at the end of the main street. The postmaster knew my name by now. He asked how I was settling in. I told him well and meant it. On the way back, I passed a gallery that had opened in an old hardware store. The front window held a ceramic piece, a simple bowl, irregular at the rim, ash-glazed in muted gray. No note explaining the form or the firing, just the object in the light, being what it was. I stood and looked at it for a while. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from being invisible on your own terms. For most of my adult life, I had been visible in ways that cost me. Present at things I wasn't invited to, necessary in rooms where I wasn't acknowledged, legible to everyone except the people who should have read me most carefully. I had believed for longer than I cared to admit that love required making yourself available past the point of good sense. It doesn't. What love requires is attention and honesty and the willingness to tell the truth even when the truth is that something is over. I turned from the gallery window and walked back toward the cottage. The wind off the water carried salt and cold and the particular smell of low tide, alive and slightly wrong, the way the ocean always is if you get close enough to it. I'd grown up inland. I'd always thought of the coast as somewhere people went to escape. I was starting to understand it was somewhere people went to think clearly. My daughter had sent 3 emails since the Saturday she'd driven to my house. I hadn't opened them. Not because I was punishing her. I want to be honest about this, but because I had nothing left to say that wouldn't be either cruel or sentimental, and she deserved neither from me. What I owed her and what I had given her for most of her life was my best thinking. I had to trust that she'd received some of it and that the rest she'd figure out on her own. That's what you hope for when you've done it long enough, that eventually they figure things out on their own. My son-in-law sent a certified letter 3 weeks after the credit card situation. His attorney's name was on the return address. The letter referenced the lease guarantee and asked whether I intended to pursue any action or whether I would consider formally releasing the guarantee in exchange for a signed repayment agreement on the outstanding informal loans. It was polite. It was also, I noticed, the first time anyone in that household had used the word repayment in 9 years. I forwarded it to my attorney. He replied to their attorney with a counter-proposal. That was the last I involved myself directly. Let the paperwork work. The scholarship announcement went out in December. A girl from Medford was the first recipient, 24 years old, studying sustainable design at the University of Oregon. Her essay was about her grandmother, who had sewn her first set of curtains when she was 8 and taught her that scale was about proportion, not size. I read her application 3 times. I didn't write to her. The fund was anonymous, and I wanted it to stay that way. There is a version of this story where I am the villain. I know that. I'm not so settled in myself that I can't see it. My daughter would say I withdrew support as punishment. She would say I used financial leverage to retaliate for a private conversation. She would not be entirely wrong. But here is what she would leave out: that I had been offering support she hadn't asked for because I was afraid of what would happen to her if I stopped. That I had made myself indispensable in a way that was never only about her. That the letter I wrote to the Design Foundation, the accounts I opened, the guarantee I signed, none of those were gifts, not really. They were insurance. They were the way I stayed close to a daughter who had been pulling away from me since she was 17 years old and who had finally succeeded. She wanted to build something that was hers. She was right to want that. I just needed to stop being the one who built it for her. The February morning I walked the stretch of beach south of town, I had my coat buttoned to the neck and my hands in my pockets. The sand was dark with moisture and the water was the gray-green of old bottle glass. I was thinking about nothing in particular, which had taken me months to get to. The ability to walk without running problems through my head like a spreadsheet. I found a small gray stone, smooth and flat, the kind Holt used to collect for skipping. He was terrible at it and insisted he wasn't. I held it in my palm for a moment, feeling the weight of it, that particular density of old stone. Then I put it in my coat pocket to keep. Somewhere behind me, in a city I had driven away from, my daughter was working through the consequences of a decade's worth of choices, mine and hers, and the ones we'd made together without quite admitting what they were. I didn't know exactly what her days looked like now. I didn't know if the studio was still standing, or if the marriage was still easy, or if she'd looked at the framed prints on the brick wall and seen any of what was actually there. Maybe she had. I hoped so. Not because I needed her to, but because the truth about any piece of work, any building, any design, any life, is that it holds together better once you understand every component in it. I pulled my coat tighter against the wind and kept walking. The ocean was loud and indifferent and precisely as old as it had always been. And I was still here, moving along the edge of it, carrying one smooth stone in my pocket and owing nobody anything except the long work of learning what to do with all this quiet.